Kia ora, and welcome to this Westpac Smarts webinar on an incredibly important set of issues, navigating geopolitics and global trends in 2024. Westpac Smarts is, of course, a year-round speaker series aimed at helping set Kiwi businesses up for success. I'm Simon Bridges, CEO of the Auckland Business Chamber, and with me are Kelly Eckhold, Chief Economist at Westpac New Zealand, and Thomas Mucha, Geopolitical Strategist at Wellington Management, based in Boston, the United States. Can I also acknowledge the support of the CFA Society New Zealand? Well, the format for today is introductory comments by Kelly and Thomas, which I'm sure you'll get a lot out of, followed by some questions by me. And then, unlike in geopolitics, the power really is in your hands through Slido. Today's session is going to run for about 60 minutes, with the last 15 or so on your questions on the burning issues that you want to touch on. And you should see that Slido there on the right of your screens. Put in your questions and, of course, rank each other's questions, and we'll ask those most highly performing ones. There's also a Slido poll on what the issues are. So let's crack into it. Gentlemen, it's great to be talking with you. And obviously, I've given a very the briefest of introductions. But perhaps Kelly, Thomas, starting with you, Kelly, if you just tell us a little bit more about yourselves.
Sure. Thanks very much, Simon. So I'm the Chief Economist at Westpac New Zealand. Been here for just over a year. Prior to that, I spent 11 years in Washington, DC, working for the IMF in the Money and Capital Markets Department. And prior to that, a long career in New Zealand at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
Thanks so much. And Thomas.
Thank you, Simon. Again, I'm Thomas Mucha. I'm Wellington's geopolitical strategist. I sit on the firm's global macro team. And so I'm advising our portfolio managers on a daily basis across the firm: equity, fixed income, alternatives, hedge funds, currencies, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the research side, I'm having daily conversations with global national security policymakers. These are current and former CIA, Pentagon, State Department officials, those on the National Security Council, and other White House officials. I'm on Capitol Hill quite frequently, speaking with national security-focused lawmakers and leaders from both sides of the aisle. And then I do the same thing with national security contacts across the world, including in Washington, Brussels, London, Berlin, Tokyo, Canberra, Seoul, and yes, in your lovely capital city of Wellington. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, with a name like your firm, you probably should spend a little time thinking about us. And we obviously really appreciate having your knowledge and experience. Let's start with you, Thomas, with, I suppose, a pretty open-ended question to, see you take it where you will. What are the key global geopolitical challenges policymakers are facing at the minute, and how's that impacting, would you say, the economic and the defence policy agendas?
Well, thanks, Simon. It's a big question. It's a complex question. But let me start with the main message that I get from the policymakers that I'm speaking with on a daily basis. To a person, they believe that we are today experiencing the most complex, the most dangerous, and frankly, the most unpredictable geopolitical backdrop we've seen in decades, probably since World War II. And that has to do not only with the number of conflicts that they're charged with managing, it's the nature of these conflicts. They're very long-standing, complex situations, but mostly it's the players involved in the geopolitical hotspots around the world. Now, these are great powers in many cases, aligning against each other in multiple spheres. So I'd say that the policymakers, when they come into work every day, the challenges are many, and they're nearly overwhelming. And I think this official pessimism that I hear from policymakers is important to appreciate from an investment perspective, because frankly, these are the people who are making the policies that impact the global macro and markets backdrop that we all need to navigate for the coming months, quarters, and frankly, years. And this is true whether or not we agree with their conclusions. The most common phrase that I hear is that we're not sure if it's 1913 or 1939, but we do know that it's deadly serious. And I hear that in Europe, I hear that in the US, I hear that all across the Indo-Pacific. So through the investment lens, I think these recent and accelerating upheavals in the geopolitical backdrop are leading to a refocusing of policymaker priorities. And those are moving strongly towards national security and away from economic efficiency in many ways that for decades, drove economic, trade, and foreign policies. I think that framework, that globalization framework, which worked so well for so long, is beginning to shift rapidly to a more fragmented world, certainly a more fragmented geopolitical order, a greater focus on protection and promotion of a growing number of strategic sectors that are today on the front lines of shifting military and economic dynamics. And this, of course, sits alongside major increases that we're seeing in defense spending in China, in Japan, across Europe and elsewhere. I think all of this is a fundamental shift in the globalization backdrop, and I think it's one that's likely to be permanent. So it's a very different world, Simon, than most of us grew up investing in, where economic efficiency, not national security, was an important, if not the most important, foreign policy focus. And I think the best way to understand what's happening around the world today is through this lens of great power competition. And simply put, can we manage through a significant reordering of the international system without geopolitical catastrophe and conflict that, let's say, every 100 years or so, the world seems to fall into? So within that serious context, all of my policymaker and investor conversations right now focus on shifting events in the Middle East, of course, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, a number of US-China related issues, ranging from Taiwan, of course, but more recently to ongoing tensions in the South China Sea with regard to the Philippines, to new concerns about North Korea's nuclear program and the impact across the region. And while each of these global challenges has idiosyncratic and historical antecedents that make them unique challenges to manage, I'd offer another important perspective here for this audience. Each of these also has these important great power dynamics flowing through them. Now, the US and its Western allies are squarely on the opposite side from China, from Russia, from Iran, from North Korea, and a rapidly emerging rival system. And these great power aspects add additional, I'd say, complexity, additional uncertainty, more risk, and more importance, frankly, to the resolution of each, whether that's the divergent US, Russian, and Chinese geostrategic interests in the Middle East, or the very different outcomes these various great powers are pushing for in Ukraine, or of course, what's happening today in Taiwan, the South and East China Sea, North Korea, and elsewhere. So again, Simon, we're seeing deeply complex, deeply interconnected challenges in play at the global and regional levels, and that's leading to much more coordination among the US and its allies. Now, lastly, in terms of grave challenges that policymakers are now facing, I'd be remiss to not mention the intersection of climate change and national security, particularly in a geopolitical environment that's already so complex and so dangerous. And what's important here is that climate change is already further stressing this background, particularly along the equator and in the tropical regions 30 degrees north and south of there. So from the Pentagon's perspective and other countries' national security perspectives, this hot zone is where some of the most intractable geopolitical crises already sit. So think East, West, and North Africa, the entire Middle East, Iran and Afghanistan, the India-China border, the India-Pakistan border, the Taiwan Strait, large parts of the South China Sea, just to name a few. So as a result of climate, which is known in my circles as a force multiplier, the Pentagon is forecasting catastrophic impacts in these regions across the next decade, particularly if we remain on these current CO2 trajectories. And that means they're already preparing for more resource wars, more climate migration, more food and water scarcity issues, more political extremism, more political dysfunction as these climate effects continue to strain the geopolitical backdrop. And I think this aspect of geopolitics today remains largely underappreciated by most market participants. It is certainly not underappreciated by the national security policymakers that I speak with every day. So, Simon, when you add together the current destabilized geopolitical environment with these rising great power stresses, and you throw in the structural and accelerating impediments of climate change, I think you begin to see why policymakers across the board are so concerned about so many of the geopolitical challenges that they currently face, and frankly will continue to face for years to come. So it's a deeply challenging backdrop, and I'll stop there.
Well, thanks so much, Thomas. I mean, I think you bring a grim, but dare I say it, a sober and realistic assessment of where things are at. I mean, I think you've talked to us about the move away globally from economic rationality, from globalization, further away from that great power competition and the camps that we see there. And I think, you pose a question that I'm sure is going to run through this entire session for an hour. Can we manage through without catastrophe? Let's bring you in, Kelly. It'd be great to really, I suppose, get your perspective, a Kiwi perspective on these very significant challenges.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks very much, Thomas, for that great setup, because I think it does accurately describe some of those really big global challenges that New Zealand businesses and households are going to have to deal with in the coming years. So I guess the first point I'll sort of make here about why should we care about this? And there's lots of really good reasons for why this should matter to New Zealand, even though it may feel like many of these events are occurring a long way from here. And probably the strongest reason is that New Zealand's a small open economy, which is very trade reliant for prosperity. That's been the feature of New Zealand since the country started. And that basically means that trade linkages, access to imports, access to export markets is critical for our well-being and our standard of living. I'll also add that we are also quite reliant on global capital flows to finance our standard of living and our investment capacity. One of the features about New Zealand for a long time is that we've been needed to steadily borrow from offshore to be able to finance domestic spending and consumption. We've had a structural current account deficit for as long as I've been alive. It's particularly high now at about 5.9% of GDP. And that basically means that we're very reliant on the ability of those and willingness of those global capital markets to continue to finance us. Getting into some of the details, like the key trade issues, really correspond to the fact that our export linkages are particularly concentrated, and particularly concentrated with some of the key protagonists, and particularly with respect to that China-US relationship. I mean, there's a couple of charts up there on the screen you can see which show the dominance of the Chinese trade relationship for exports. But also the importance of the United States and Australia as well, which you could consider the opposing bloc. So New Zealand really is kind of like sitting in the middle of those protagonists. The other thing I'll say about our exports is that we are very much a price taker in markets. So we can't really control what people pay for our products. It means that our well-being is pretty cyclical and obviously critically determined on what's going on in those international markets. New Zealand is a long way from the rest of the world, so we're heavily reliant on logistics to be able to get our goods to where they need to get to. And we're obviously very reliant on the ability to be able to source imports as well, which allows us to produce what we produce and obviously consume as well. And, one of the features about New Zealand that we've seen for a long time is that a very large external sector shock does tend to have a pretty big hit on domestic consumption. And I guess I'll take you back to thinking about what happened to New Zealand during the Asian crisis in the 1990s, where there was a sudden drop in demand amongst our trading partners up in Asia. And the impact of that typically is felt in the exchange rate, where you can get a very sharply depreciating exchange rate. but it's usually associated with really weak per capita incomes as well. So, this is quite important, that trade linkage. In terms of the security issues, what is going on here that's making the New Zealand authorities particularly interested? I've got a couple of charts up there that really just highlight the sensitivities that New Zealand has to all of this. I mean, in general, because we trade a lot with all of the key protagonists, we really do have an interest in trying to maintain a fairly balanced position. We've historically tried to be everybody's friend here, so that we can trade with everybody. That's a very sensible position, I think, for a country like New Zealand to take. But when the big guys fight as well, and increasingly we've seen this in recent years, there sometimes does create a need to choose. And the kind of question there really is, where do our interests ultimately lie? Is it going to be within one bloc, which might be Australia and the United States, or might it be with the large trading partner of China? The authorities here have tended to focus quite a lot on New Zealand's quite strong regional interests, which are heavily in common with Australia. And that's particularly around how Pacific develops, and also the development of some of those key ASEAN trade partners. Think about Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, etc. So we're trying to balance those interests. And the sort of reasons there is, firstly, the trade linkages, but look at the physical linkages as well. Our access to kind of global communications is critically determined by having the availability of those lines operating through the Pacific. Similarly, with our trade, with our logistical linkages as well. The fact that we're physically isolated really does imply a pretty strong interest here in siding with people that can keep those channels open. Otherwise, there'll be quite significant implications for New Zealand. On the capital flow side, I've mentioned before that there is a really strong tendency for the New Zealand dollar to be strongly impacted by risk aversion in global markets. We typically see that in periods of stress, like in the global financial crisis and also in the Asian crisis. And that stems from the fact that New Zealand has quite significant external borrowing requirements. We've got a very large current account deficit, a very large net international investment position, 51% of GDP on the most recent data. Gross liabilities to offshore are upwards of 140% of GDP. So if the flow of financing was to slow or stop for some reason, that has significant implications on the ability for New Zealand to refinance itself. The exchange rate usually takes that buffer. But, what we've tended to see is that research from the IMF has indicated that the capital flows between like-minded countries tend to be more resilient in recent years relative to those that are perhaps trading between blocks. So that's kind of thinking about, well, sort of what can we expect in terms of the availability of capital for New Zealand in the event of a step up in antagonism between the rival blocks. In terms of sort of what we hear from customers, what we're hearing here that when faced with these risks, customers have taken steps, particularly post-COVID and the Russian war, to improve the resiliency of their supply chains. Obviously, COVID was a really good example of the vulnerability we have. It's no longer a focus on just finding stuff at the cheapest price. It's about making sure that you can get it on an ongoing basis as well. Some of our food ingredients importers, for example, are very conscious of rising global risks from delays in the receipt of goods, for example. And our exporters are particularly focused on those shipping type effects, but so far they haven't really been significantly adversely impacted. More in the longer term, the exporters' focus really is on looking to diversify our export markets, particularly taking advantage of exporting more to those strongly growing ASEAN countries. That's not something that will happen overnight, but you saw, for example, the recent trip that the Prime Minister did up to ASEAN to sort of try to encourage those sort of relationships as an example of that sort of concern. Overall, the key messages here is that New Zealand does have interests on all sides. It doesn't make sense for us to strongly side with one or the other, but risk management is a real growing concern, And, in general, firms should be thinking about de-risking their supply chains, and for New Zealand in aggregate, looking to diversify those trade relationships are really important, albeit something that is not going to happen overnight. So with that, I believe we can move to our poll, which I think we were interested to hear from you all, is, which of the sort of biggest issues do you think are the highest priority for your business? It's a multi-choice. Please put in the results and we'll see how we go. There's a whole range of pretty big geopolitical issues circling around out there that could be of interest. So please let us know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's without being glib about it, Kelly, it's a little bit like sort of asking people, which would you prefer, cancer or anthrax? I mean, there's a lot of, really difficult issues there. Thanks so much for what you've said. I mean, I'm minded, we're starting off about us as a small open economy. We really are a cork, even if it's a Sauvignon Blanc cork bobbing on the ocean. You've talked about that dominance in our trade of China, albeit the US and Australia are there quite strongly. And really, I think you posed that vexed, thorny question that a lot of people are grappling with. Do we need to choose? And really, it's an issue of risk management. And you've talked diversification, ASEAN. Actually, I see very recently the start of negotiations with UAE. So there's a lot going on there. I think as we get into sort of discussion, gentlemen, it's hard not to start with, probably the event of the year, presidential election 2024 in the United States between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Really be keen to get from you a sense of the significance of this. I mean, I think we can all say it's significant. The policy and the economic implications. And Thomas, you giving us that global perspective, of course, and Kelly, I think you bring it back home to New Zealand and what it means for us. So, yeah, take it away, gentlemen. US elections, Thomas.
Sure, thanks, Simon. And, I'll start with the obvious caveat, which is, we are 6 months out from the election. It is therefore far too early to have much conviction on the outcome, particularly in a country that's so divided politically right now. Anyone who comes to you and says they've got a good idea of how this will play out isn't being 100% honest with you. I think we'll have 17 or 18 narrative shifts between now and November. And I think global and domestic events in the United States will continue to play an outsized role in adding to what is a quite high degree of uncertainty here. That said, Simon, you asked me the question. It's the right one, so I'll try to answer it here. And I'll start with, I know you hear this every 4 years, but this time it's probably true. I do agree that November's election is likely to be hugely consequential from a geopolitical and foreign policy perspective, given the divergent philosophical approaches of both President Biden and former President Trump. Now, before I get into these differences, I think it's also important to note that everything we're talking about here today is long-term, it's structural, it's bigger than any one leader or any one party. I mean, these are massive fundamental changes occurring in the global and geopolitical backdrops that will continue to be with us long after whatever the next 4 years in DC brings us and brings the world. But that said, who occupies the White House will matter across the short and medium terms, and it will certainly matter from a global investment perspective. So let's start with a Biden 2.0, which I think is a little bit easier to analyze here. In fact, I can sum it up with 4 words, more of the same. I think we'll see a continued focus and likely an acceleration on these multilateral, multinational economic and security institutions with a focus on traditional US allies in Europe and across the Indo-Pacific. I think we'll also see continued policy focus on the protection and promotion of a number of strategic sectors that are so critical to great power competition. I think we'll be moving beyond semiconductors and into potentially biotech, critical minerals, other decarbonization and green technologies, space-based technologies, and of course, AI and quantum. but there will be others. And from a foreign policy perspective, I think a Biden 2.0 gives us continued friction with China and Russia, continued support for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, and for the institutions that are out there, security institutions, both in Europe and across the Indo-Pacific. So again, Biden gives us more of the same, but a continued fractured and a still unstable geopolitical landscape that's going to continue for the next 4 years and beyond. Now, moving to a Trump 2.0, I think it's safe to say, given what we know about the first administration, that this would be much more unpredictable and much more transactional by nature. I think you would see much less reliance on multilateral agreements for the most part. So this will certainly be a challenge to leaders across the world, how to play to Trump's, let's call it particular leadership style, while maintaining their own country's security and economic interests. So yes, this will be a big challenge, and it will be a global challenge. But I think the big difference with Biden will be on Trump's economic policy. I speak regularly with his campaign team and people who are close to him. There's going to be a much greater focus on trade and trade measures, aimed, of course, at China first, including higher tariffs. They're talking about 60% tariffs. I don't think that's likely, but there will be higher tariffs. I also think there'll be more aggressive use of executive branch trade measures like we saw in the first administration, such as Section 301, Section 232, as well as a wider swath of other executive orders. But I think this trade-heavy agenda will also be applied to some U.S. allies, particularly in areas that are direct or have direct national security implications or have convenient domestic political benefits for Trump. And the most common ones that I hear are agriculture, energy, critical minerals, and autos. Those are coming up a lot in my discussions. But by all accounts, and in my conversations with this team, the former president remains fixated on the trade deficit. And so, and ways to get that down. And so I do expect a noisier, more contentious Trump 2.0 if we get it. And I think that would likely contribute to even more uncertainty, even more global friction, starting with China, but extending to other potential U.S. allies, and a wider set of potential outcomes across the geopolitical environment. And then the last thing I'd say here, of course, is let's not forget that the makeup of Congress will matter greatly to this outcome. It appears, again, 6 months out, that we're headed for a divided government with separate control of the House and Senate and the White House. But, again, this could go a lot of ways. So it's not just the presidential election that matters here. We have to keep, at least one eye on the congressional outcomes as well.
Great objective analysis there, Thomas. Kelly, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I sort of take a theme for New Zealand out of what Thomas has just said, Biden is more of a known unknown. So, a bit more of the same, not particularly a return to the sort of international relations we saw in 2000 to 2020 is probably a reasonable expectation. And probably that's something that the New Zealand government and New Zealand business can probably more reasonably operate with and anticipate. It'll probably be an environment where New Zealand has probably the choice to go along with whatever the Americans or the Australians decide that they want to do, and it'll be down to New Zealand to basically determine just how far they go. With respect to Trump, I mean, he's more of the unknown. One of the economic factors that I've been particularly focused in is the implication of these tariffs on New Zealand, because as I explained in my introductory comments, we are obviously heavily trade focused, and trade is an important part of the relationship that we have with the United States. I mean, the sense that I've seen there from Trump is that he's interested in across the board tariffs. That's because of that general focus that he has on the trade balance, basically. So, and we're a country where basically we're we're probably exporting more than we're importing in that regard. So there's obviously some firms there that are going to have to contend with that. And I guess another issue is the potential that these tariffs will be differentiated across countries depending on the nature of the relationship with the country. So even though New Zealand itself may not necessarily attract the highest tariff out there, some of our other trading partners, for example, China, could receive quite significant tariffs, and that would introduce third country competition impacts, which means that others who perhaps previously might have been exporting into the United States will be dumping or potentially trying to sell competing goods into the markets that we also trade in. This is a recipe, I suspect, for commodity price volatility, which would have impact on New Zealand incomes and ultimately on the New Zealand dollar as well. The other thing that is high on my mind here is the implications for technology transfer and investment as well. The AUKUS 2 initiative is primarily, I think, about kind of the ability to be able to access leading edge technologies. And it's not all about space lasers and fancy submarines and things like that. I mean, New Zealand doesn't have much interest in that, but we might have an interest in having access to the latest AI chips and other electronic sort of like goods that are being produced within the United States, but which perhaps won't be available in China. That's going to be quite important, I think, in terms of being able to, New Zealand to be able to keep up and be able to boost productivity. And as we all know in New Zealand, productivity is our key challenge in terms of being able to maintain the standard of living. So that investment linkage, I think, is quite important and might in the end be something that really does push New Zealand more towards the US camp versus the other camp, because we may just end up falling behind some of our peers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's really good thoughts there on, I think, very thought-provoking on the tariffs and AUKUS. There's so much we could talk about. I think that unpredictability in foreign policy, dare I say it, particularly from a Trump presidency and what that means in terms of Putin, Iran, Israel, China, and so on, we could spend hours on. And then the tariffs and that economic significance, say, very, very important for New Zealand. I think, though, we better keep moving. I'd be keen for us to sort of move this along and look a bit longer term, if you like, the structural changes you see occurring and the economic and geopolitical implications from that. Who wants to go first there?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Simon. Thank you. So, we've touched upon some of them, but let me emphasize that great power competition, this deepening global tech competition related to this, what Kelly just mentioned, and of course, the ongoing response to climate change are three interrelated and I think all critically important structural themes that will produce profound implications for years to come. There's a lot we will be doing with our portfolios along the way, but I think here I'll offer just a couple of brief thoughts, starting with the macro perspective. I'll put my macro hat on for a moment. First, I think we should all be preparing for structurally higher inflation and structurally lower growth than the heyday of globalization, given these dynamic changes that are going to occur across certain strategic sectors and supply chains, et cetera, and for all the other reasons we discussed here today. I think this also means less synchronous and more differentiated economic cycles than we've seen in the past. The second thing I would say about what this means is that, again, everything we've discussed here today is likely to be disruptive for a very long time and in a lot of different levels, country level, regional level, industry level, company level, asset class level. And so from a strict investment perspective, when I hear the word disruption, I think differentiation. And we're already applying this approach across Wellington management portfolio strategies, finding winners and losers across the board. So I do think that this is an ideal time to steer more aggressively into active management, to apply these top-down structural changes in the geopolitical and policy environments to a more opportunistic mindset. Third, and because these are long-term structural changes, I strongly believe that thematic investing has a much bigger role to play here in coming months, quarters, and indeed years. I think we'll all want more exposure to these themes that governments all around the world will be supporting for national security and other reasons. Four themes, come to mind for me. The obvious one is legacy defense. Given the stresses in the geopolitical backdrop, the huge increases that we're seeing in defense spending globally, and frankly, the need for countries around the world to build up their defense industrial bases in the face of ongoing conflict. So I think that is a long-term structural theme that has plenty of legs. I'm actually even more interested in this sub-theme of defense innovation. These are these dual-use civilian military applications that are at the forefront of great power competition, particularly those that the Pentagon, the PLA, NATO countries, and other militaries around the world are now fully deploying. So think semiconductors, next-gen communications, these space-based technologies, robotics and automation, given what we've seen on the battlefields of Ukraine. And then, of course, critical minerals and other renewable energy technologies. And then the big challenge, one that Kelly just mentioned, of course, is AI and quantum technologies, because those applied to national security applications is likely to be transformational in terms of power. So I think, legacy defense, defense innovation, I sort of split those two. Climate adaptation, I think, is the most direct way to invest in climate change. The goal here, when I talk to the Pentagon, the CIA, the White House, is really making societies around the world, and especially in that equatorial and tropical hot zone that I mentioned earlier, more resilient to rising temperatures, to more storms, more flooding, food and water scarcity issues. I think that's a critical and durable theme that I spend a lot of time on personally, because it's the best insurance policy for managing through these coming geopolitical disruptions that climate change will continue to exacerbate. So I'm a huge proponent of climate adaptation. And last but not least, the energy transition theme. Because again, as the Ukraine war and other recent developments yet again underscore, every country around the world and every leader that I talk to views energy as a core and strategic asset. And I think this growing national security imperative will only accelerate these incentives to move more countries more quickly down the path of decarbonization. So yes, there are a lot of themes here. Yes, this is a sobering message, as you said at the outset. But I think we should strive to think of geopolitical upheaval, not so much with a sense of pending doom, but rather, with a sense of opportunity. And I say that because, as capital allocators, we do not lack agency. In fact, I think the opposite is true. And I continue to believe that we have a tremendous opportunity today to deploy capital that can both make great returns for our clients, but also alleviate a lot of the problems of the current national security backdrop. So I'll end my comments here on that relatively optimistic note.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you're talking about constant disruption, or as you said, another word for that, differentiation. And with differentiation does come opportunity. Kelly, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of themes there. I guess the highest level theme I would say is that New Zealand probably for the last 30 years benefited from a relatively benign trade and capital flow environment. And that seems set to change. Even if there is not a really significant disaster, it seems quite likely that the operating environment in which New Zealand is existing in will be less benign than it was. So practically what that means is, for example, with respect to capital flows and the cost of borrowing, it means that we'll probably have to pay more than we have gotten used to. And also with respect to trade, it means that there'll be that greater focus on resiliency of supply chains means essentially it'd be more costly to export and import as well. And potentially that focus there, I think, on risk management is going to be much more pronounced. And the thing with risk is that it's never costless to get rid of it. You are going to have to pay for that. I think the climate change comments are very relevant from Thomas there. I would agree with him that we are probably going to see some very significant relative price changes in things like energy, but also food as well, which are going to have divergent impacts on New Zealand. Most of them are probably going to generate inflation. And it wouldn't at all surprise me, for example, if central banks have to rejig their inflation targets to accommodate what might be a very significant but persistent relative price change. But on the exporting side, there could be some opportunities as well. New Zealand is an exporter of food. This is an environment where I suspect prices for food will rise as the price of carbon rises. So there will be opportunities for the New Zealand agriculture sector to potentially benefit from that. I guess the message, though, from our sustainability focus here is that we will have to have our nose totally clean, because a lot of the focus on climate risks and sustainability, these can often be turned into an opportunity to impose trade barriers. And, with this environment that Thomas has discussed about greater global competition, when the chips are down, people usually look after themselves. We saw that very quickly during the COVID period, where borders quickly closed, for example. And, to the extent to which New Zealand is doing something that can be marketed in another jurisdiction as being kind of undesirable, it could potentially be used as a mechanism to close out access to those markets for exports and things as well. So hence, needing to stay in front of the game on the sustainability space is really important for New Zealand. Last thing I'll mention, we are very reliant on the world for oil and petrol here. We closed our last refinery a few years ago. All of that energy comes through the Asian trading routes. And I guess that will be something interesting for New Zealand in aggregate to think about in terms of sort of, okay, we're going to have a big move to renewables over the next sort of 10 or 20 years, and New Zealand is relatively well placed to deal with that. But nevertheless, the availability of petrochemical inputs are key to the operating New Zealand. So thinking about the resiliency around some of those sort of issues, I think will be important to be able to kind of manage risks in the economy.
Very good point, Kelly. Before we go to the poll and Slido and some really good questions here, just relatively brief answers, gentlemen, on, the elephant, or really, dare I say it, the panda in the room. A couple of questions here. What measures do we think NZ businesses should be taking to manage risks associated from a more fractious relationship between the United States and China? And relatedly, probably the hardest question for New Zealand right now, how practical is it for New Zealand to continue to take a middle path in terms of maintaining relations with both the United States and China in the event of a more heated relationship in the future?
I'll let the Kiwi on the call tackle that one first.
I think it'll be a real challenge if some of the worst scenarios eventuate. And the reason I say that is that in my previous role, I was working on Russia at the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and I was amazed at just how quickly the environment shifted to emphasize the sorts of changes that could be forced in a very short period of time. I was involved with writing memos suggesting that things like, well, there's no way that Russia will get cut off from SWIFT. That oil, gas, coal, kind of like exports for Russia are too important to Europe, that they won't be stopped. But I mean, actually, you can sort of see what happened kind of within a couple of months, basically, to that, when the chips were really down. So I think kind of like thinking about that means that we've there's a real risk there for New Zealand in some of those worst scenarios, even though it may seem quite incredible from where we sit now.
Yeah, I would add from my perspective, Kelly, that as investors, we tend to have a very rational view of the world. We tend to put our own sort of economic or market biases into our own analysis. And I would emphasize that in a time of geopolitical upheaval, which I firmly believe that we're going through, leaders make different calculations, particularly when it comes to what they perceive to be national security. And so every conversation I have with these leaders, with these policymakers, is really emphasizing this national security piece of it over the economic efficiency piece. And I think we're going to have to retrain ourselves in a lot of ways to understand where those priorities sit and how rapidly they're changing. I think that does, from a New Zealand perspective and from any country's perspective, really, I think that first hits this question of supply chain resiliency. So I'm happy to see the audience here keying in on that. I think that is the first place we're going to see these stresses. And then I would say that the geopolitical environment is a critically important piece of this puzzle to pay attention to right now, simply because the United States and its allies and China and its allies sit on divergent sides of just about every conflict that's happening right now in every tension spot, from the Middle East to Ukraine to the South China Sea to the East China Sea. And what concerns me from a market and macro perspective here is that something stupid happens in one of these areas. And history is a long list of stupid things happening. But given the political dynamics in Washington, in Beijing, across Europe and across the Indo-Pacific, if we have some sort of incident where, God forbid, soldiers are killed on either side, I think we could move pretty dramatically to a much more rapid decoupling away from de-risking and more towards the types of steps that would be that much more disruptive from a macro perspective. And so again, supply chain resiliency is important, but also understanding the dynamics of the current geopolitical environment so we can better assess the probabilities of one of these things going south.
Yeah, I mean, I think your 1913 scenario, which might have sounded somewhat overly dramatic not so long ago, as you say, is more realistic today. The chance for miscalculations with all the unpredictability, and I suppose it highlights the need for Mr. Blinken to do what he's doing, get out there and may not like everyone he talks to, but talk to them and have channels of communication. Hey, Kelly, what's the priorities we've got there on that poll?
So the priorities,
take us through that.
Yeah, I mean, the priorities are fairly, I would say it makes sense given the sort of like the risks that are probably closer to the middle of the distribution, which I think managers would naturally be quite focused on. The financial market volatility impacts and the resiliency of supply chains and costs have obviously been very front of mind for businesses in the last 5 years. And in New Zealand's case, the sort of exchange rate volatility, interest rate volatility has been a feature of our experience for 30 or 40 years now. So it's natural to think that that's obviously something that businesses are particularly focused on. I guess the other risks, I mean, they give rise to these sort of impacts, but they're kind of more slower burn and tail event risks. And I guess I would emphasize Thomas's point there that awareness and understanding is quite key to be able to kind of like get a sense of what could be coming down the road and being able to prepare. Because like most of these really bad scenarios are probably not going to happen. I mean, we're talking about risk here as opposed to certainties. But at least being aware about what's going on out there, I think is quite critical to be able to prepare.
That's right.
If I could jump in and add one point to that, I think it's really important. It's almost a fool's errand to try to determine what is going to happen in each one of these myriad crises. These are highly complex situations with all sorts of variables. What's easier to determine And frankly, what's easier to invest in is these trends that are developing as a result of this increased focus on national security, supply chain resilience, more defense spending, a fracturing trade and economic environment. And so I think, what you want to do as an investor is don't get in the prediction business, get in the directional business. And there, I think, is where we want to be focusing our capital allocations.
I think that's a really profound point. Let's go to, in the last 10 or so minutes, the Slido questions. And I'm not going to do any choosing here. I'm just going to go to those that quite simply have the most popularity. Tane's written one, very popular. Is there a possibility of a global economic split into a liberal maritime alliance of United States, Canada, UK, EU, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and SGP, etc., versus continental authoritarian regimes, the PRC, or Iran, Russia, et al., where the two systems are decoupled? No pressure, gentlemen. It's a small matter, and your thoughts. Your thoughts succinctly as well.
Sure, I'll jump in quickly, and I'll let Kelly follow up. I think that's the path we're on, frankly. And I think we're certainly on that path when it comes to these strategic sectors that both the United States and its allies and China want to decouple. And I'm quite confident that we're on that path in a select number of industries. These are the ones that we've mentioned before: semiconductors, next-gen communications, space, automation, AI, quantum, all of these things. Why am I confident that that's the path we're on? Well, it's not just happening from the West perspective. In fact, China telegraphed these same intentions more than 10 years ago when it put out its Made in China 2025 program. It identified the same 8 or 10 sectors where it wanted to reduce its own dependencies on the West for these same reasons. And so both sides want to do this. Both sides want to do this in a telegraphed, managed fashion. Again, what worries me is, a geopolitical event that forces a sudden decoupling. And so again, it increases the importance of understanding the probabilities of something unsatisfactory happening in the geopolitical environment. But I am confident that we're on this path to a more bifurcated, not only international system, but economic and trading system. Now, there will be linkages, of course. It won't be the same as it was in the first Cold War, but there will be echoes of it.
I would just add to that I certainly would agree there's pretty significant risk with that, but also focus on the countries that will be in the middle, because there will be some countries in the middle, like think about Brazil, think about some of India is a really good example. India is right in the middle now, for example. There's a few, some of the Indian countries. There's been a suspicious increase in German exports to Central Asian jurisdictions, for example, which, is a way that people try to get around this bifurcation. Some of those sort of relationships may become increasingly important to us in this new environment.
And I think you go, Thomas.
I was going to say, I'm just agreeing with Kelly that this is going to lead to a much more fractured international order, a much less contentious one, where cooperation will be even more difficult to engineer. And that's a huge negative when you have these multi-national problems like climate change, international terrorism. The pandemic is a really good example of this, where international coordination would actually help. But we're moving towards a structure that does not promote that level of cooperation.
And I think it does highlight your, very good point, Thomas, that, don't focus on picking winners, as it were, but the structural trends. And that's true around geographies as well. Look, another good question here from Michael around insurance and reinsurance. With more disasters, natural and other, happening worldwide, how does the reinsurance market affect insurance in New Zealand and businesses, households? So you talk to us, maybe you, Kelly, first, what you see happening in the insurance sectors and what that all means.
Well, what we've tended to see is a much greater move to risk-based pricing, and that's one of the reasons why insurance has been particularly growing strongly in price here and globally as well, for that matter. But also there is a sense that New Zealand's a relatively small market, so given the sort of general kind of capital flows risks here, we should probably also be thinking about the availability of insurance, particularly if the risks are perceived to grow too high. There are parts of the world, for example, you can't have earthquake insurance or fire insurance, for example, Japan, California, both examples of things like that. It seems quite plausible to me that the financial system and the economy may need to adjust in some way to be able to accommodate some of those risks.
And I'll just add, Michael, that was an excellent question. I do think the insurance industry is on the front lines of this, of these great trends. Climate change, of course, is changing those variables, as Kelly just alluded to, but so is the geopolitical environment. Getting ships through the Red Sea over the past 6 weeks. Insurance costs have skyrocketed as a result of these rising geopolitical risks. So the insurance industry, which is critical to fostering capitalism throughout its entire history, is likely to have to grapple with a whole new set of challenges.
Good point. Back on the second biggest economy in the world, the CCP has explicitly said they'll reunify Taiwan by force if peaceful means don't work. Are Kiwi companies with a large revenue reliance on China naive to the actual risks?
Naive is a very strong term. I think there's a hope that things will work out in a relatively conciliatory manner. And the reality is that China relationship is so large that it's actually impractical to just change it very quickly. Particularly with respect to our dairy and timber exports, for example, there just isn't really anywhere else for that to go in the very short term. So I don't think it's naive. I think it's just a recognition that it's a hard job that's going to have to be worked on over a long period of time. I think there must be growing awareness, though. I mean, you can sort of see it in official circles now. So I think that should be filtering through to businesses.
Yeah, I couldn't point to any other geopolitical issue that gets more concern from my national security contacts than the future of Taiwan. And obviously the stakes are enormous. I've had calls recently from the Pentagon where they brought in the head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Fleet specifically to talk to us about these risks. I've heard these rising risks from party leadership on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill, from the White House, from the CIA, from the National Security Council, on and on and on. And so the risks are real, or they are being perceived as being real by the people who are crafting policy. The last 12 to 16 months have been extraordinary in terms of the steps that the United States and its allies have taken with regard to deterrence related to Taiwan. We've had new basing agreements between the United States and Japan and South Korea. The Philippines, we were seeing 4 new military bases in the Philippines, new military bases in Guam. The U.S. military is repositioning its Japanese forces into other parts of southern Japan, closer to Taiwan. We've mentioned the AUKUS deal, which is a very significant development. The Quad has also been picking up an activity that's the US, Japan, India, and Australia. All of these things have happened in the past 12 to 16 months. In normal times, these events would have taken 5 to 6 years to engineer. So I think it shows you through their actions and not just their rhetoric, how seriously the national security policymakers are taking this risk. And, I could find people in Washington or in Brussels or in Canberra or Seoul or Tokyo who think the war is a lot closer. And then I can find people who say it's 5 to 10 years off. And so there's not a lot of unanimity in terms of predicting that precise moment. But again, let's invest in the trend. Let's see the forest here. And from my perspective, that's pretty clear.
So just speaking then of AUKUS, I think pretty good question here really about the significance of it. From Jeremy, is any US administration, Biden or Trump, likely to care if NZ doesn't or does join AUKUS? Will non-membership have any repercussions?
So did you say, would it care if India joined? Is that what you said?
No, I'm sorry. Really it's around what's the US's stance to New Zealand AUKUS, joining, not joining, what does it matter?
There's been a big increase in US-New Zealand defense coordination over the past, I'd say, 6 months. The United States would obviously like to continue the deep strategic relationship that it has with New Zealand. Let's not forget that New Zealand is part of the Five Eyes Alliance, which is the most important intelligence alliance in the world. But the U.S. will be prepared to move on and work closely with Australia, with the UK, with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, with Indonesia, with Vietnam, as we're with Thailand, and of course with India, as we're seeing in all of these multilateral arrangements. So yes, adding New Zealand to that coalition, I believe would be a huge, the U.S., any U.S. administration would be hugely in favor of that. But I think there's also a very sophisticated understanding that all of this has to go through domestic politics, regardless of the country. So it's a very tricky dynamic.
Well, can I just say, gentlemen, thank you so much for so much insight. Thank you to everyone for watching. A recording of this is going to be provided in the post-event email, which will be sent to you all if you're on here. And there'll be a survey poll to the right of your screen. So please do give us your feedback on today's webinar, as we'd really appreciate it. Once again, thanks so much.